Alrighty, so continuing on, I'm not sure exactly where that last one cut off, so I'm going to go back a little bit. Number 7 was be picky with words. So poetry being a sparse, condensed form of language, we want to have the right words and not any wrong words. So think about the words you're using, think about what associations they might have, think about what they might mean, and pick the right word and not the wrong one. Like we said with last time, the whole God is bigger than the air I breathe. Sounds cool at first, but then you're like, wait, what does that mean? That's not really the right words. Number 8 with poetry is edit, edit, edits. This is true of all writing. Novel writing might be about 50% initial draft and 50% editing. Poetry writing is 10 to 25% initial draft, and the rest you have to edit, edit, edit. All of my best poems have been edited more than 10 times. The original sometimes was good, but what made it really good was when I went back and I made it deeper, and I added a couple more layers in there, and I moved this from there to there because that didn't really make sense how it was before. And I deleted that because it wasn't really that good, or it was just repeating something I had already said. Okay, so moving on into more things about poetry and into literary terms. So poetry has rhythm and sound. There are different ways to write poetry. Some poetry would be written in iambs or different sorts of feet, which would be like da 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 or da 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 or da 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 or da 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 da. So those are the most common feet. I don't remember the names of them all right now, but those are stress. You have those are phrases where you have the stress after a certain number of syllables. Lots of people like to write that way. I don't. I would rather mimic the rhythms of how we would normally speak, which do have stress patterns. They just aren't repetitive and the same. The thing that I don't like about the repetitive and the same stress patterns is they tend to sound like you're being a little cutesy or kiddie, or super formal, which is not what I'm going for, particularly in worship music. So you've got those things, and then you've also got how many feet you have per line, which is called your meter. So as we've talked about before, Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter, which is da 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 5. Sorry, I skipped one there. That was iambic tetrameter, which is very common for songs. Okay, so in having sounds, you can play with sounds when you're making poetry. So for example, you can have alliteration. So alliteration is when you have the first letter of words repeated over and over again in the poem. For example, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration of that initial P sound. You can also have rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and I love you. So rhyme is really, really common. Again, like I've said before, I'm not really a big fan of rhyme. Once you can write well, then you can start making things rhyme if you really like rhyme. But it's more important to be able to communicate what you want to say than it is to put it in rhymed lines. Because most of the time, when you haven't been writing for a long time, you're just going to make it cutesy, and you're going to make rhymes that don't really need to be there. There's also like half rhymes, which we call assonance. Assonance is when we have the same sort of vowel sound, but it doesn't quite rhyme. I'm not going to really give you an example of that because I don't think it's that important. Consonance is similar to alliteration. You're just repeating the consonant sounds. Dissonance is where you would have a conflict between the different sounds. So you would have like maybe something that would go in one way of speaking, and then you would have something else come in that would be a completely different way of speaking, or a different rhythm of speech, or an interjection, and that would give you this feeling of, whoa, what just happened? This is different. This is important. We have a change here. And you can also have internal rhyme. So instead of rhyming at the end of every line, you can rhyme in the middle of your line. Like, for example, true it was that he was blue. The true and blue give you this sound feeling, okay, yeah, there's an echo there. But it's not at the end of the line, so it sounds a little less cheesy and sounds a little more sophisticated. We've also got sounds affecting your poetry in Onomatopoeia, which is where we get a pop, a slap, a smack, a crash, a clanging gong, a crashing cymbal. So you can almost hear these sounds just in the words themselves. So any word that kind of has a sound, a strong sound, that sounds like the action of what it's doing, you can almost feel it or hear this sound. So all of these things that I've just mentioned are ways that poetry is sound, and you should think about your sound. You should think about this from time to time. What sounds good, And I like to do this instinctually. I don't like to think about, okay, I'm gonna put this sort of vowel here and that sort of vowel there. No, I just like to go, okay, that sounds good. Okay, no, that doesn't sound good. But sound, a lot of poetry involves sound. And sound is one of the most important parts of poetry. Next we have images. So images evoke scene and emotion. So, if I say Manhattan skyline, skyscrapers as far as the eye can see, concrete, asphalt, a bum on the street, you probably know what I'm talking about. Talking about New York City. And if you've been to New York City, if I said the right kind of images, you would, well, even if you haven't been to New York City, because you've seen films and because this is a part of our culture, you would sort of get a mental picture in your head and you would start thinking about, oh, okay, Statue of Liberty, are we by that? Central Park maybe. So you have this image in your head of New York City. I just say New York City, and you will have immediately pictures come into your mind. Oh, New York City, that's Madison Avenue, that's Broadway, that's Times Square, that's Statue of Liberty, that's the Brooklyn Bridge. So as soon as I just say the word New York City, you have all of these associations and emotions and images that come along with it. So that's a non-specific image per se, and the thing about New York City is if I just say New York City, it would mean different things to different people. But just saying New York City evokes a place, it evokes scene, it evokes some kind of emotional response probably. So when you want to show and not tell, you want to use these kind of images. You want to show people where you are. You want to show people what you're talking about, so that they can feel themselves in the same place as you, so that they can understand what you're talking about in a concrete way. Again, show, don't tell. Which means we're going to want to use stories, not just statements. Especially if we're going to do songs that are going to be more evangelistic in nature. It's really, really, really pretty lame if we're just going to go like, and I've heard a bunch of songs recently that were this kind of way that are just like, Jesus is the truth and I don't care what other people say, like, Jesus is the only way. That might be true, but the only people who are going to agree with you on that are probably people who already believe that. And the only people who are going to listen to that are people who already believe that. And the people who don't believe that are going to listen to that and go, one, that's terrible poetry, and two, I don't understand what you're talking about. What? Jesus is the way to where? What do you, like, huh? You're just using a Christian cliche, which is something that a lot of Christian music is very guilty of. You're just using a Christian cliche to say, hey, I'm part of the in-group, and are you with it or not? That's not cool. So we don't want to do that with our songs. If we're going to talk about God and talk about Jesus, we want to do it in such a way that people can understand it and that people can access it, whether or not they have this Christian culture. So let's talk more about specific literary devices. The first most common literary device is a metaphor. So the 23rd Psalm uses a great metaphor, and it's an extended one. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd." So a metaphor is where we say something is something else that it's actually not. But we're using an analogy, we're using sort of an image to say that to expand our understanding of the second thing. So when we say God is a father, we're obviously not talking about God being my real dad, but God is like a father. And so this metaphor helps us to understand some aspects about God's character and who he is and what he wants and stuff like that. So those are two examples of very, very common metaphors. You can use metaphors that are a lot more interesting in worship songwriting. Whether it is metaphors about yourself. For example, one of my favorite worship songs compares the singer compares himself to a wretch and a homeless person and a beggar and a whore. And that's really powerful. Got to be a little careful with how you do that, but it's really powerful. And all of those things are things that have been done time and time again. A simile is really similar to a metaphor. It's not really that different. It just we're not being quite as crafty, and we're using the words like or as. So when you say God is like a father to me rather than saying God is my father, that's a simile. It's really the same basic thing that's going on. We're comparing one thing to another thing, but we're actually just saying, yeah, we're actually showing how we're doing that. I'm trying to think if I can think of a really good example of a simile used well in a worship song. Metaphors are generally going to be better, I think. Images, like I mentioned a little bit before, could be any of the five senses or any sort of emotion or feeling, and even more than that. But we'll start with just the five senses and talk about, touch. So one of the things that we hear about a lot in a worship song is fire, which gives us this sense of warmth. It gives us a sense of something we could feel, Water is the same way. There are lots of different things that we can touch. We can talk about, brushing. We can talk about a hug. That would be something that would appeal to our sense of touch. We can imagine God hugging us, and we can feel that. So your sense of touch is one of your five senses, and images that revolve around touch are powerful, and they can make people feel something, and they can help you communicate what you're trying to communicate about, how God has touched you. The most common sort of image is, of course, going to be your visual images. We can see art, we can see beauty, we can see nature, and we can talk about how we see that, and we can paint the picture for people, and we can say, hey, this is this beautiful picture of what we have around us in the world, and I believe this is God. There are some really good examples in worship songs of this. For example, Your Love, O Lord, which is a psalm. Your love reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness stretches to the sky, your righteousness is like the mountains. There was a simile. So we're giving all these nature images. Another example of this would be You're Beautiful. I see your face in every sunrise, the colors of the morning are behind your eyes. And so we're getting this beautiful picture of a sunset, and we're seeing that as like the color of God's eyes, and like he's looking at us, and there are these warm, beautiful colors that are being shown, and these colors and this painting gods behind it, and it's a very beautiful song. You can also have images that would be taste images. So any sort of food, any sort of, there are some sorts of places you can taste as well. Food is the most obvious thing to use, but it could be some sort of drink. It could be a kiss. It could be the ocean. You really can taste the ocean on your tongue, or some sort of climate, whether it's the forest or something like that. This also involves a sort of smell that is almost a taste. Obviously, there are things you can hear. Again, you can use the onomatopoeia, or you can use sounds in the poem to get to this, but there are also just, we can talk about music, we can talk about the crashing of the waves, we can talk about the jackhammers, building a new and all the sounds of construction, building a new building, which would be interesting for a worship song. Any sort of sound that you can hear that makes you think, oh wow, yeah, I've heard that before, or I can imagine that scene with that noise and all of that. That is an image that puts you in the place. You also have smell. Kitchens are full of smells. Fire has a specific smell. Again, going back to the ocean, that has a specific smell. Flowers have a specific smell. There are lots of different smells. Urine has a specific smell. Flooded houses have a specific smell, and all of those are things that those could have something to do with working with homeless people, or they could have something to do with cleaning houses after Hurricane Katrina, which is something I did. So smells can be used in different ways, and smell is one of our strongest instinctual reactions. Again, this is one where if you get too cute with trying to create smell imagery, it's going to get really obnoxious. But at the same time, it can really help you understand something. I like, there's one Toby Mac song that uses the line, "Nobody ever told me that my doo-doo stunk." And the basic metaphor is, and it's something we can relate to, like, oh man, like, I smell and my junk in my life smells, and we all know what what our poop smells like. And he said, yeah, like, the things in my heart that I have, they're kind of like poop. And, I kind of thought I was so cool and all above that and such an awesome, clean person, but I figured out actually that my poop stinks just like everyone else's. I lost the example I had of this next literary device, but you can use puns in a serious way. Not all puns are cheesy and silly like the corn having ears. There are serious puns that you can use that would be really good literary devices. I can't think of any right now, but you can use a play on words to really bring home a really powerful point and have it not be necessarily a super cutesy thing. So the only example I can think of right now is I was working with one of my friends on some songs, and she had this one song that says, "I guess this is Dubai." And of course the phrase is, "I guess this is goodbye." But we're playing with the words and kind of making it sound like two different words at once. And Dubai is where she actually was when in the song, and so it's got this double meaning, and it is cutesy, but it actually just kind of gives you a deep feeling, especially with the way she sings it. We've got a couple more literary terms. So we've also got things like metonymy and synecdoche. So metonymy and synecdoche is where we talk about something using part of that something. That's synecdoche. Or metonymy is where we use something associative. But these are both some sorts of substitutions. So when you say, the suits over on Capitol Hill, well, obviously the suits aren't the ones doing the talking. Sorry, a little sick. The suits aren't the one doing the talking. People in the suits are doing the talking. But when we say the suits over on Capitol Hill say that blah, 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 which is mostly what they say. We're using metonymy or synecdoche, depends on how you, but suits are something we associate with politicians, and so we know we're talking about politicians or rich people, right? Synecdoche is a piece of the whole, so like, if we talked about, Jesus as a carpenter, and we said like, oh, those hands made 1,000 tables and walked all up and down Galilee, and finally they touched me. This would be an example of synecdoche, because Jesus' hands weren't the things doing the walking up and down Galilee. They're a part of the whole, but we understand that we're talking about Jesus. And while we're focused on his hands, we're focusing on how he touches people. We're focusing on how he was a carpenter and stuff like that. There's some songs like Daddy's Hands, I think, that talk about that. Country music. Yeah. So there's some good country music out there. Another thing we can do is personification. So personification, the most cliche version of this that we hear in worship music is the rocks are crying out and the trees are lifting their arms in prayer, or the birds are singing worship songs. Are the birds singing? Yes, but are they actually worship songs? Well, we're kind of reading that into them, and we're giving them human-like qualities, which is personification. Hyperbole is another literary term we can use. Hyperbole is obvious exaggeration to prove a point. Now, this sounds kind of weird to do in a worship song. Like, why am I going to exaggerate in a worship song? Well, you know, if you say that something like, I love you more than words, you're probably exaggerating. Well, more than words is kind of one of those ones that doesn't make sense, but some hymns really use hyperbole in a really powerful way. So, for example, there's a song, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's prayers." Like, do I actually want 1,000 tongues? Like, that would just be weird. They wouldn't all fit in my mouth. This is obviously not something where I'm literally asking for 1,000 tongues. What he's saying is, I really wish that I'm so full of this desire to praise God that I wish I could be more people so that I could sing more praise, you know? He's obviously exaggerating about wanting 1,000 tongues, but the point gets across really clearly. So hyperbole is something you can use even in worship. We can exaggerate, but you got to be careful with it. So what are some other things that I see in good worship songs? I've got a list here, and this will be the end of the class. So some things that I see in good worship songs, and this comes from the Hebrew poetry a lot, is good contrasts. Some sort of parallelism. You know, we've got this, and then we've got that. So we've got Amazing Grace and A Wretch Like Me. I love you, but I fall down. Sin versus mercy. What I say versus how I live. These contrasts, and especially if you put them in some sort of parallel form, can be really powerful ways of communicating what you're trying to communicate. Obviously, you got to be careful. You don't always want to be creating a dichotomy, and not everything that we are talking about fits in. There's this and that, and there's no in between. You know, there's a lot of gray in how we live, and we're basically muddy people. We're not well, I mean, we're sinners, but we're also saints, and like, so our whole is a mix of these different aspects of us. Again, images. Let's go back to the Lord is my shepherd. You know, Psalm 23, good worship songs have good images. So Psalm 23 talks about the Lord is my shepherd, and then he talks about he leads me beside still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures. I'm a sheep. I love still waters and green pastures. They're just really good for my soul and my tummy. These are really strong images that people can relate to because they've seen shepherds. At that time, shepherds were a really, really common part of life. And we also know how a shepherd cares for his sheep. The song How He Loves Us. He is jealous for me, loves like a hurricane. Like, we've got this image of, and I am a tree. There you've got, he loves like a hurricane. So we've got almost, I'm not sure that's a true simile, but we've got a sort of simile idea there where God is like a hurricane. Then we've got a metaphor, I am a tree. So I'm sitting here as this tree, and God is blowing me, moving me, bowling me over maybe, even knocking me off my feet. Really cool metaphor, and that song is very well written. We've also got, like we said, You're Beautiful, all these images of the sun and moon and stars and all of this. God of Wonders has similar images. It Is Well With My Soul uses all this ocean imagery, because when he was writing it, he was on the ocean, thinking about his family who had died in that place in the ocean. And so he talks about peace like a river, and sorrows like sea billows, like big waves in the ocean. And he says, even so, it is well with my soul. So images are really important in good worship songs. Another thing that I see in good worship songs is that they're honest and believable. I believe what you're saying when you say it. It doesn't sound like you're trying to be someone you're not. I don't believe that you're trying to convert me or make me think a certain way into a certain theological thing. You're just expressing what you feel and what you've been through. Good worship songs are emotional, but also God-centered. They have an emotional component. We can feel something in them, but our emotions are not the end-all be-all. Our emotions are not the final say of the song, per se. And especially for